Hello, my name is Ariel Gonzalez. I'm an English professor here at the Wolfson campus of Miami-Dade College. We have begun a series of faculty recommendations for readers. So I'd like to talk about a book or recommend a book that, if you're interested, you may like to read. This book is Her Smoke Rose Up Forever by James Tiptree Jr. Now, any of you who might be science fiction fans may be familiar with the name James Tiptree Jr. He wrote mostly in the 1960s and 70s, and he was primarily a short story writer. He did write a novel or two, I think, but mostly it's the short story that he is recognized for. The thing about Tiptree was that he was very innovative in the sense of his discussion of gender, of men and women. And aside from being, of course, a great writer himself, he was also very interested in the relationships between men and women, the power dynamics. He was so well known, so celebrated that the editor Horne Ellison gave one of his stories pride of place in his anthology Again Dangerous Visions. Again Dangerous Visions was a follow-up to a groundbreaking anthology that Ellison had edited a few years earlier, Dangerous Visions. And Ellison really liked Tiptree's work, and he begged him for a story, and he put him at the end of the anthology and gave him an effusive introduction. And in the introduction, he compared him to another contributor in the anthology, Kate Wilhelm. He said, Tiptree is the man to beat this year. Wilhelm is the woman to beat, but Tiptree is the man. Okay, what Ellison didn't not know at that time, in fact, not many people in the science fiction field knew at that time, or actually no one did, was that James Tiptree Jr. was not a man. James Tiptree Jr. was a woman. He was a she. And his real name was Alice Sheldon. And there's another book I'd like to recommend, James Tiptree Jr., The Double Life of Alice B. Sheldon by Julie Phillips, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award. It's a great biography, and it reads like a novel because Alice Sheldon's life was like a novel. She didn't get into science fiction writing until her 50s. She was around 54 when her first science fiction story was written under the pseudonym of James Tiptree Jr. Now, it's not unusual for a woman writer to take on a pseudonym, a male pseudonym. That's happened in the past. You had George Sand in the 19th century, the Victorian novelist George Eliot. This is a common, this was a common occurrence because obviously female writers did not feel that their work would be accepted by the predominantly male publishing industry. And so they felt they had to take on a male persona. But in the 1960s, you had this revolution in the science fiction genre. It was called the New Wave, where you had, of course, science fiction had been around for a long time. You can trace it all the way back to H.G. Wells in the 19th century, Jules Verne. But in the 1960s, the science fiction became accelerated in the sense that writers wanted to experiment with the genre. They wanted to make it much more radical, much more controversial. They brought in issues of race, of gender, of sexuality, politics into their work. And so she came at a very opportune time for a science fiction writer, who wanted to subvert conventions, especially subvert conventions concerning gender. Now, again, go back to for a moment to go back to Sheldon's life, as I said, her life reads like a novel. By the time she was 10 years old, her parents had already taken her on 2 African safaris. She had traveled the world with her parents, who were an affluent couple from Chicago. Her mother was a rather well-known travel writer. She wrote, and novelist, she wrote 23 books herself, her mother. She would later become a captain in the U.S. Army during World War II, Alice B. Sheldon, working on interpreting reconnaissance photos. That's where she met her second husband, Huntington Sheldon, and then became Alice Sheldon, taking his name. From there, they both joined the CIA in the 1950s. Now, they weren't spies, but they did work with the Central Intelligence Agency. Her husband on some rather hush-hush stuff that is not too clear in Philip's biography, but she was also part of the agency. Then later, in her 40s, she went back to college to get her college degree and then pursue a PhD in experimental psychology. All this while, of course, traveling and involved in many relationships, sexual otherwise. She was, again, a fascinating person. And so when she started writing science fiction, she was able to use her experiences, to draw from them, to try to craft this new way of looking at the world. Now, her Rose, Smoke Up Forever are not all her short stories. They're some of her classics. And so if you are interested in Tiptree, you may want to begin with this. And just to give you a taste of what she's like, just to give you a sense, there is, for example, the story, The Girl Who Was Plugged In. This is a story, again, set in the future, where a morbidly obese woman is made an offer, or she's a girl, she's only 17 years old, to connect herself to a computer and by remote control manipulate another girl, this gorgeous model-looking girl. So it's basically her brain controlling that young, perfect body. And it's an interesting story because it talks about the feminine ideal of beauty, at least as it's perceived by society. And so what Tiptree was trying to do was, I think she was trying to make a comment about the way that we perceive women and their bodies, whether they are what we call beautiful or ugly. There's also a story, The Women Men Don't See, which reads like an action story. It begins with a plane crash in the Yucatan Peninsula. You have the survivors, the pilot, a Mayan Indian, a mother and her daughter, Americans, and the narrator, a man. Now, again, I stress the point that Tiptree would often tell these stories from the perspective of a man. She'd choose a male narrator, which I think is fascinating. Here is a woman pretending to be a man, at least as a writer, telling stories about women from the perspective of a male narrator. I find that, I think because in The Women Men Don't See, the male narrator, really doesn't see them. He completely misinterprets everything the women do, the mother and the daughter do. And at the very end, this is where the science fiction element comes in. The mother encounters aliens, and the narrator thinks he has to save her. And that being saved is the last thing the mother wants. And again, that is the male instinct. The male instinct is to save women. And most men think, well, I have to rescue women, I have to save them. And in the story, what Tiptree, I think, is trying to say is that women don't want to be saved. That what you think you're saving them from is what they want. Then there is the screw fly solution, which I think is their best story, at least my opinion. And this is a horror story. There is an epidemic unleashed. Men are killing women. It's called a femicide. And they're just violently murdering women around the world. And scientists are having trouble trying to figure out why. They finally conclude that there's a virus. There's some sort of virus that's driving men to kill women. And the men who are infected have rationalized this by turning into a religious ideal. In other words, their view is that God has told them to kill women, to remove them from the earth. And again, this clearly is a comment about religious fundamentalism or religious extremism, at least when it comes to women. Now, I'm not going to give away the spoiler, but there is a science fiction element at the end. I don't want to give away the spoiler, but it does not end happily. But but with all the stories, of course, that we hear about violence toward women, I think the screw fly solution is very, very relevant. So anyway, I hope I've given you some indication or an idea of why you should give Tiptree a look. Because I think that whether you're a man or a woman, you will benefit from the experience of reading him or her, whichever gender you want to look at Tiptree through, whichever lens. So thank you.